Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and something interesting has just come out from Mantic Games. Over a year ago I made a video on the KOW Armada starter set and how to make the resin ships in it, and that is one of my most popular videos and keeps on getting thanks from people new to the hobby, and so I'm very happy with it. But Mantic have now released these models digitally as STLs for you to buy, download and print with a 3D printer at home, or have a friend print one for you. There is a big discussion to be had here about how model companies don't want to give out digital versions of their models in this kind of way, but I won't be having that here. Today I'll just be painting up the Orc Bloodrunner that Mantic have released for free as a sample. They have also released the Panther ship for the Besselian fleet, but the Bloodrunner has always been my favourite of the whole line, and so I'm going to do that. Having a look at the files, they very much seem to be the digital sculpts that Mantic used as the original version for their cast models. However, there are a few minor changes. In my original video building the Panther and Bloodrunner, I pointed out all of the pieces and how they assemble. The Bloodrunner has, I think it was 9 parts, but the digital version only has 3. Rather than having its guns and prow separate, it's all together in one piece. And this is partly because 3D printing and resin casting can make different shapes, and so you want to support them or vent them in different ways. And if we're only 3D printing this model, separate pieces just aren't necessary. Similarly, the sails and the masts are combined rather than being separate, and they have this sort of blocky bridge between them. I'm not entirely a fan of this really, as it's quite visible on the final model. And sure, it makes it easier to print and it's stronger as a final model, but I'd rather have this open and deal with those difficulties. Speaking of difficulties, the FEP on my resin printer was damaged when I printed them, and so I had some print failures. I did reprint one of the sail pieces, but rather than to reprint the hull, I just printed off the prow to glue on, which I roughly guessed at where the failure was, and I got it nearly almost close. This is certainly not an issue with the files, as my printer was in a state of disrepair at the time, but I fixed up the failed print with not a lot of effort, and I even got to use some milliput to make some extra planks over that fault line. But while you do need to know how to deal with a 3D print, I don't really think I need to discuss it in here, because if you own a 3D printer, you probably know how to run it, and if you're getting someone else to print for you, then they should probably know how to run it. And we can finally move on to painting the model, and the hull is actually going to get less effort in painting it than it did in fixing the print. As the hull of these ships is partially hidden by the sails, I think that it's better to paint the hull fairly quickly and simply and then spend extra time on the sails. And so the hull got a base coat of brown, a dry brush of brown and a wash of brown. There's plenty of metalwork in there as well, so I picked those out with a silver, and that was pretty much it. Overall, this is very similar to how I painted my original Orc ships, and just like those models, I will be making resin bases for them, and so the hull will disappear for the moment in this video. Painting the sails is actually also very similar to how I've painted the ships in my previous videos. I did the masts in the same way as I did the hull before moving on to the sails themselves. I thought about what colour I could paint the sails, and I've considered that every ship in my Orc fleet could be a different colour. Or maybe I could paint each class of ship with a different colour so I can tell them apart. Now, the old Bloodrunner had blue sails, and I do like blue. Well, I think the decision is made. Let's paint them blue. I started by painting in the areas that I would leave in the deepest, darkest shadows with my deepest, darkest Nachtblau, night blue, which is a beautiful, ever so slightly purpley blue. I mixed in just a little bit of some brighter blue, and I finished off the base coat in all of the other surfaces, giving me a nice mid-tone with a strong shadow fairly quickly. With some more of that lighter blue mixed in, I layered up some highlights on the upper surfaces, and this is a pretty common technique, so there's no real explanation needed here. The last step for the blue was to outline the loops where the sails are attached, and then I painted the ropes with an ochre. Probably the biggest visual difference between the original resin cast and this 3D printed version is the axe emblem, which is absent on the original. I remembered that I had painted them black on some of my other ships, and so I did the same here. Black base coat with just a little highlight of grey. All told, painting these ships is really quick and quite satisfying. I quite like them. Some dry brushing for the finely detailed hull, and then big open areas for layering or some other fancy technique like wet blending on the sails. Comparing the two, the new digital downloadable version is clearly the same ship, with some just minor alterations. The changes to the hull I really can't argue with, one solid piece that prints out just fine, although I did end up with a lot of support marks on the stern. The changes to the sails I'm maybe a little less happy with, although they aren't necessarily a bad thing. I liked having the open sail to paint on, and it gives a nice space to add some freehand or decal or some other emblem, whereas the 3D printed version has the axe emblem enforced upon you, which is fine. I just like the option of an open sail. Also, because they have those bridges to strengthen the gap between the sail and the mast, they look a little strange, and I'd rather have an option or an alternate version with those removed as well, even if it made it harder to print. Realistically, the digital version is perfectly fine. It's a great model that does print well, if you've got a better printer than mine. I certainly do want to discuss the kind of a big model company releasing STLs of their models and the method that they're using for distribution, but I'll save that for another video. For now, I have another ship and the capability to print many more, which might be fun. As I mentioned, the Bloodrunner is my favourite ship from the Mantic Armada line, and so I can say I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.